I spent 2 years doing extensive research into the Manson family before I began writing this story. I continued my research throughout the writing process, constantly gathering new insights into the family's perspectives, behaviors, and crimes. While writing my first draft in the fall of 2017, news broke that Charlie had died at the age of 83, and thus ended a significant chapter in the Manson family lore. But still today, false narratives continue to perpetrate, including ones that impact those family members still in prison. I read hundreds of books, articles, and blogs that caused me to eventually understand that Helter Skelter was not the true motive for the murders. But I did not have a foregone conclusion as I began writing this what the true motives were. I was able to write the material up to this point without committing to any conclusions or biases about motive. I'll be frank with listeners that my research not only helped me understand the family, but also humanized most of Charlie's followers. I already was predisposed to think of them as brainwashed cult followers as opposed to dangerous psychopaths, but researching and writing the story made it clearer as to what each person was responsible for and what were the circumstances they were forced or coerced into. Had Charlie been released from prison at any other time than the late 60s, it's possible he may not have achieved the levels of manipulation and notoriety he became infamous for. But it's also possible that another Manson lurks among us now, someone on the borderline of psychopathy who will seek to dominate others and unleash a bloodbath, even though times are very different now. Dismissing the family's actions merely as part and parcel of the weirdness of the 60s is to fail to recognize the triggers that actually lie within us all. Whether you believe that the killers were sociopaths, or brainwashed, or drug-crazed, the fact is that if we label them monsters and disassociate ourselves from them, we fail to understand how they wound up committing their crimes. We fail to recognize that if they could be pushed to do what they did, so can others. It isn't really possible to predict a Manson, but it's very easy to prevent and predict future Susans, Patricias, Leslies, and others who are susceptible to trafficking and manipulation. Knowing what motivated the family helps us learn how to prevent these atrocities in the future and how to protect ourselves. Helter Skelter, Charlie's belief that a race war was imminent, that he and his family would survive the apocalypse, and he would rise to lead the world, was one of several factors that compelled the killers that terrible summer. And again, this author believes that using the Helter Skelter motive in trial was probably the right call for the prosecution. But you should see now that Helter Skelter was not the only or even primary motive for the murders. In no particular order, here are several of the possible motives. Motive 1. Rage. Charlie's rejection by recording insiders, coupled with his early developmental experiences, which led him to resent conventional society and desire to eliminate those who stood in his way of success. That included his followers as well as the establishment. By summer 1969, Charlie's rage had peaked. Motive 2. Drug dealing. The family's criminal ambitions put them at odds with more established dealers like Joel Rostow, Bernard Crowe, and the Straight Satans, and revealed their own ineptness and desperation for power. Motive 3. Drug addiction. The family's growing dependency on hard narcotics, which led the killers to become delusional and dangerous. Motive 4. Helter Skelter. Their belief that a race war was coming, that they were to be the benefactors, and thus were justified in creating the tipping point if Helter Skelter did not happen spontaneously. Motive 5. Cult programming. The family's loss of self-identity and autonomy following months or years of systemic programming by Manson, which, among other beliefs, conflated their view of death. Many followers did not believe they had the choice to leave. And in some ways, the killers did believe they were freeing their victims by slaughtering them. Motive 6. Money. The family's financial woes. By the summer of '69, they'd burned every bridge ever extended to them. These are 6 significant motives for the murders of Shorty Shea, Rosemary and Lino LaBianca, Sharon Tate and her unborn child, Wojtek Frykowski and Abigail Folger, Jay Sebring, Stephen Parent, and Gary Hinman. But how you rank them depends on what you're looking at. If we're examining Charlie's personal motives, they would probably rank in the following order: rage, money, drug dealing, drug addiction, helter-skelter, the desire for it. Because Manson is the alleged cult leader, he is not influenced by motive 5, cult programming. For Susan, Patricia, and Leslie, their motives might include cult programming, drug use, helter-skelter, Manson's rage. Tex Watson's motives could have been drug addiction, drug dealing, cult programming, Manson's rage. Watson admitted in his memoir that he didn't believe in helter-skelter. Bruce Davis, Steve Grogan, and all those who killed Shorty Shea were likely motivated by Manson's rage, cult programming, helter-skelter, at least the pressure that if Shorty succeeded in getting them thrown off of Spawn Ranch, their ability to shelter from the coming storm was in jeopardy. All of these perspectives are valid and informative, but the correct way to look at motive is based on time or narrative, the sequence in which things actually happened. When you start at the beginning with the murder of Gary Hinman, motive becomes a lot clearer. Money. The family were broke, and someone told Charlie that Hinman might have an inheritance. Beausoleil was specifically sent to get back the money from the supposedly botched mescaline deal. Rage. Manson's at Bobby for failing to resolve the matter and putting him at the scene of the crime. Drug dealing. Bobby's bungling attempt to get in the good graces of the straight Satans by brokering a drug deal which allegedly went awry. This was right on the heels of Tex Watson burning another drug dealer and possibly beating up another dealer a few months before. The family were literally the most inept drug dealers in history, but the fallout was landing directly on Manson, a parolee at risk of being thrown back into prison. Cult programming. Beausoleil acknowledged that as a child he was molested, and he was vulnerable to Manson's persuasions. Plus the women, Susan and Mary, were terrified of Manson, who held their children to sway them to do his bidding. Again, Mary had once been bedridden for several days after one of Charlie's beatings. Drug addiction. The family were using heavy amounts of drugs that summer. Bobby procured some of Hinman's mescaline for their own use. It's unclear if anyone was under the influence that weekend, but it likely impacted their behaviors and thought processes. What isn't a factor in Gary Hinman's death? Helter-skelter. None of Hinman's killers believed that helter-skelter was happening that weekend, nor did they believe that they were killing Gary to make it happen. The only role that helter-skelter played in Hinman's death was that Manson warned Beausoleil to keep the straight Satans satisfied because they needed the bikers when they went to the desert. And of course, he told Bobby to leave evidence pointing to the Black Panthers. But Bobby, Susan, and Mary never cited helter-skelter as a motive for Hinman's death, because it wasn't. The main motive was money. Money was the first and primary motive for why the family killed Gary. The second motive was Charlie's rage and the killer's fear of what he would do if Hinman went to the cops. The third motive was Bobby's botched drug deal, which jeopardized the relationship with the bikers. The fourth motive was the killer's willingness and ability to murder after years of Manson's control. The fifth motive was potentially the killer's own drug use, which certainly clouded their judgment. Money, as primary motive, also goes back to the robbery and shooting of Bernard Crowe, an absolutely pivotal tipping point in what would become the family's descent into murder. Although it is the secondary motive, Manson's rage is significant. He actually believed Hinman's denial of tainted drugs, but needed to placate the straight Satans more than he needed to appease his gentle musician friend. Plus, Hinman had just declined to join the family and donate his inheritance. This pissed Manson off, but rather than acting upon it himself, he ordered Bobby to do the dirty work and sent Mary and Susan knowing their sons were in his reach. When Bobby failed to bring the situation under control, Manson's anger exploded. He then had to show Beausoleil how to take care of Hinman, but in so doing, implicated himself in a serious crime that would likely send him back to prison. So he pushed Bobby to kill Gary to protect himself. 2 weeks later, when Charlie realized that Bobby's arrest meant that he was still on the hook for Hinman, plus Bernard Crowe, his rage became an inferno. When the women he sent to steal supplies prevented him from escaping to Death Valley, that's when he decided to start Helter Skelter, retaliation for not getting his fucking way. When the first night of murder didn't result in enough carnage and shockwaves across the city, he sent the killers out again. And when Helter Skelter still didn't start, and someone ratted him out to the cops, he sicked his men on one more soul. But the Hinman murder, because it is the first, and because it directly led to the others, is key to understanding motive. Cielo Drive happened because Bobby was locked up for Hinman and might have implicated Charlie. 5 people were murdered to create a distraction. The LaBiancas were killed because Manson decided that the previous night wasn't gruesome enough. The murder of Shorty was to protect Manson before he could flee to Death Valley. Shay's death is the saddest of all because if law enforcement had done their job properly, the family would already have been apprehended for their involvement in the Hinman, Tate, and LaBianca killings. It was ridiculously short-sighted of each of the homicide teams not to connect the dots. They already had Beausoleil in jail for killing Gary. They should have recognized the bloody writing at Cielo and Waverly and linked it to Topanga Canyon. That would have led to Spawn Ranch, Manson, and the others. Barring all that, police also had the family in their custody in mid-August while investigating them for auto theft. If the LASO had properly served the warrant, the killers would have remained in jail several more days, enough to tie them to Tate LaBianca. If they'd remained in jail, someone would have talked. We know that because once a few of them were in jail, one did. But 10 people were ultimately killed because the Manson family was broke. That's the true motive, with a secondary motive, Manson's rage against the establishment and his own followers, plus 4 sub-motives: drug dealing, drug addiction, cult programming, and, of course, Helter Skelter. Remember that Charlie said, after sending the killers out again the night after Sharon and her friends were butchered, "In learning of the popularity and wealth of the victims, I suddenly felt cheated that the kids had come away from the scene with less than $100 in cash." Or how he seriously contemplated Lino LaBianca's offer to take Charlie to get cash from Gateway Ranch Markets. "I thought about leaving Tex and some of the girls to guard the wife while the guy took me to his store. Hell, I thought if he owns a store and has offered me anything I want, maybe there were big bucks there. But then I thought he's just buying time." The statement in particular about how he felt cheated that the kids got little money on August 9th tells us that he was motivated by the desire for more money and enraged that his followers failed to do his bidding, as commanded. Money, plus Manson's rage, were both telltale signs of one significant thing. Charlie was going to leave his family. At some point, he would have deserted them. He was too scared to leave that July and August, believing that the Panthers were after him. So he found a way to eliminate the family members that he no longer wanted, one by one. Each killer was selected very carefully by Charlie. As Susan wrote, "When Manson heard that I wasn't able to hold the gun on Gary Hinman during that murder, he made sure that I was included in the Cielo murders. When he heard that Linda Kasabian had run from the Cielo murders, he made sure she was included on the night of the LaBianca murders. He shamed Bobby Beausoleil into committing the Hinman murder by pointing out that he, Charles Manson, had already shot Bernard Crowe. Then he shamed or psyched Charles Watson into the Cielo LaBianca killings by pointing to the sacrifice that he and Bobby Beausoleil had made for the family with the Hinman murder. He then psyched out Steve Grogan into the Shea murder by pointing to Beausoleil and Watson. One by one, everyone was dirtied until no one was left to finger Manson." Charlie wanted the killers to get rid of his enemies, but he was willing to sacrifice those followers in the process. His rage at Bobby's ineptness, at Tex's selfish ambitions, at Sadie's contrariness, at Patricia and Leslie's disloyalty, put those specific killers in their victims' homes. Money was the primary motive, but Manson's rage fueled the motive. Charles Manson is also a con man, Susan Atkins explained. He will constantly try to get you to underestimate him. He will try to make you feel sorry for him. He will tell you how bad life has been to him and how rough his upbringing was, that his mother didn't want him, that his teachers were mean to him, that society withdrew from him. But this is just a learned con. It is not true. Charles Manson had everything. At one point, he had almost 30 young girls taking care of him. He hobnobbed with the Beach Boys and attended Hollywood parties, musicians, and movie stars. He lived for free off the generosity of soft-hearted people who believed in him like Dennis Wilson. He never once had a job in the 3 years he was out of jail. Free drugs, free sex, famous people around him. He lived a dream life. He was offered everything America could offer a single man in the late 1960s. Manson was finally rejected by society, not, as he likes to tell it, because they were cruel and worldly establishment people who didn't want to get off his back. Charles Manson was finally rejected by society because he was a manipulative user who abused the people who tried to be nice to him. Everyone who ever tried to help Charles Manson was ultimately made a fool for their troubles. Charlie had almost everything he wanted, but when he couldn't get fame or power or money, he decided to destroy the world. He was willing, even gleeful, about turning the children of America upon itself. He relished knowing that those who wielded the knife were stabbing it into versions of their parents, their siblings, themselves, the people he hated, those who represented everything he was not. Destroying society began with demolishing his family. In a 2015 documentary, Bruce Davis rather adroitly explained, "The crimes are just the fruit of the tree. The crimes are just the part you can see." Manson's rage is what fueled each murder, but his rage was provoked by a lack of fucking money of all things. Now, people kill others for money every day. It's not sexy. It's not exciting. If the story about the Manson family murders began with headlines that read, 10 innocent people killed because hippies needed more money, nobody would read that shit. Not that there was anything mundane about these crimes. They slaughtered a pregnant movie star, for God's sake. They invaded people's homes wearing black clothing, barefoot and crazed. They tortured and tormented their victims. They smeared the victims' blood all over the walls, leaving incendiary messages, and they promised they'd do it again and again. The Manson murders were not committed to start a race war, but rather based on a need for cash. It's ironic, isn't it? All 3 of the women they killed were wealthy. Sharon Tate and Rosemary LaBianca, they both had money. Abigail Folger's family had millions of dollars. If they had kidnapped just that one woman, Rather than killing her and so many other innocent people, they probably could have had enough money to buy their own damn ranch wherever they wanted it. Not that ultimately that would have satisfied Manson, because clearly his ambition was bigger than a cozy piece of land for his followers to grow tomatoes. But nobody had to die. Helter-skelter wasn't coming. It never came. These murders just left dozens of broken families across our nation. Now, I want to shift gears just a bit here to discuss 3 other potential motives for the crimes discussed at length by my fellow Mansonologists. First, the motive known as love of brother. This is the claim that the killings were orchestrated largely by the women to free Bobby from prison, because he was a member of their family and the girls were desperate to get him out of jail. I would align this potential motive somewhat with the cult programming portion of the motives, in that the women believed they owed it to those in the family to protect and serve them, particularly the men. Their allegiance to Bobby, who was never more than a fringe member of the so-called family, feels like something they were conditioned to hold, and less like a true bond with Beausoleil. The second motive is the rumor that Charlie had no role in plotting the murders at Cielo Drive, that he wasn't involved with the selection of that property, and that the real reason for going to Benedict Canyon late that night was to get back at Wojtek Frykowski, who had allegedly burned Tex Watson and Linda Kasabian in a drug deal days before. The problem with this theory is that Charlie not only accompanied the killers the next night, but drove them to the location, entered the home of Lino and Rosemary LaBianca, tied them up, and selected 3 people to continue the bloody crimes of that terrible weekend. There is no evidence that Watson and Kasabian were running a drug ring together, that they had ever met any of the victims, or that they chose that property for retaliation. I would remind listeners that every one of the convicted killers has served decades in prison and had countless parole hearings, as well as numerous interviews going back to long before this new drug burn rumor began. And their stories align with each other. Charlie never attempted to claim that Charles Tex Watson was the real leader of the family or the mastermind behind the crimes, nor has anyone else directly involved. It was Charlie's rage that led to the selection of Cielo Drive, a home that represented all that he could not and would not achieve. It was a symbol. Tex Watson didn't get turned away from Cielo Drive 6 months before the murders, and Tex Watson hadn't been ordered off the property. Charlie was rejected by the owner of that house. Watson had actually done some yard work at Cielo Drive, and Patricia, Susan, and Linda were very clear that it was Charlie who told them to get in the car and do what Tex said. He didn't give them orders, but they understood by his selection of each of them that he had given Watson orders. Manson's orders, not Watson's. The third potential motive refers to the recent allegations that Charles Manson, or members of his family, or both, were pawns in an intelligence operation designed to discredit the counterculture. It is a fact that programs like MKUltra have attempted to create subliminal assassins to take out enemies of the state, and that some of their subjects were selected from inmate populations. I simply have not found credible evidence to support these claims. Instead, I find evidence after evidence that Charles Manson, a self-taught spiritual guru, hardened ex-convict, type B personality disorder, and sex trafficker, manipulated a bunch of teens and young adults into believing he was a messiah, that they were chosen for leadership, that murder was the only way to not only ascend to power, but to survive, that there was, in fact, no death. Charlie himself later admitted, Helter-Skelter wasn't a lie. It was just Bugliosi's perspective. Everybody's saying it the way they want to remember it. Sure, it was going on, but it was just part of the part. The reasons was all kinds of different things that were happening in Tex's mind and all of our minds. There was a lot of motives, man. You had a motive for every person there. It was a collective idea. It was an episode, a psychotic episode, and you want to blame me for that? Sociopaths and psychopaths are born every day. They're somewhere between 3 and 5% of the population, higher in males than females. But a Charles Manson is a once-in-a-generation creature, if we're lucky.